Two bodies found in a river. Sounds like the start of one of those gritty crime novels, you know?
Right, you always see that.
But this isn't fiction. This is real life. And the case we're diving into today has some seriously wild twists and turns.
It really does, and it's one that a lot of you have been asking us to cover, so
Exactly. Listeners wanted a deep dive, so let's dive in.
let's.
Okay, so we're talking about the deaths of Matthew Johnson and Christina Dixon. Both were found in the St. Mary's River in Fort Wayne, Indiana on September 20th.
And right from the start, the circumstances surrounding their deaths raised red flags.
Totally, because even though it was a double homicide, the victims, well, they weren't killed the same way. Johnson was both shot and stabbed, while Dixon died from strangulation and suffocation.
Which right away suggests a more complicated picture than a random act of violence. Different methods point to a possible personal motive, maybe even something targeted, like revenge.
And get this, just one day later, the police arrest 29-year-old Dominique Washington.
Now, that kind of quick action by law enforcement usually means they've got a strong case, maybe even an eyewitness or confession.
Makes sense, but there's
Yeah.
always a but, isn't there?
Always, and in this case, the plot thickens when we learn about Johnson and Dixon's possible connection to law enforcement.
Right, things took a turn.
To say the least, because the Fort Wayne PD came right out and said that Johnson and Dixon had worked with the Richmond PD as confidential informants. They'd even helped them out in a drug raid, apparently.
But then,
Yeah,
and this is where it gets really interesting,
you can say that again.
the Richmond PD goes on their official Facebook page and denies any involvement with the victims. Flat out says they weren't informants.
Yeah, you don't see that every day. Talk about conflicting stories.
It's a mess, right?
Leggy.
But it's more than just some disagreement between police departments. This back and forth is at the very heart of this whole case.
100%. I mean, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Johnson and Dixon were giving information to the police. That opens up a whole can of worms.
Totally.
Like,
Right.
was their murder a way to silence them permanently, to stop them from talking? Or could this whole situation be putting pressure on investigators to create some distance between themselves and what might be considered risky tactics?
I see what you mean.
Because let's face it, admitting to using informants can be a legal nightmare for law enforcement, not to mention the PR disaster.
And to add another layer, you've got the Richmond PD vowing to bring justice for Johnson, Dixon, and their families. But with so much still up in the air, what does justice even mean in this situation?
Right. Is it as clear-cut as getting a conviction against Dominique Washington? Or is there something much bigger at play here?
It's a lot to unpack.
Because imagine, just for a second, if one of these police departments wasn't being straight about Johnson and Dixon's involvement. That throws everything into question. You're talking about potential corruption, cover-ups, the works.
And suddenly, we're not just talking about a double homicide anymore.
Exactly. This case could blow up way bigger than anyone ever imagined.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. We're left with more questions than answers. It makes you wonder, just how often does something like this happen? How much do we really know about what goes on behind the scenes, particularly when it comes to law enforcement and their methods?
Makes you think.
It really does. And honestly, it's kind of a chilling reminder that the most gripping stories aren't always found in novels. They're happening in our own backyards, full of unexpected twists and ethical dilemmas that are anything but black and white.
Yeah, the line between fact and fiction gets blurred pretty quickly.
And as for this case, who knows how deep this thing goes or what else we'll uncover. It's a story we'll definitely be keeping our eye on.